Welcome to the world of curiosity. Today we're going to explore a very curious scenario where humanity has decided to colonize its neighboring planet and develop its own civilization. We know that this future isn't so far away. With the advancement of technology, in a few years, humanity will send its first crew to explore the Red Planet. In this video, we'll speculate about what would happen to our species if this colonization were successful, with the creation of a new civilization in the long term. Firstly, if humanity were able to overcome the enormous challenge of reproducing on another planet, future generations would be very different from what we are today. This is because, through much natural selection, our bodies have adapted to Earth's environment, becoming what they are today. If humans go to Mars, the bodies of future generations will adapt to the new environment. This would bring about a natural physical adaptation of humans born on Mars. Mars has about 38% of Earth's gravity, a thin atmosphere, and greater exposure to solar radiation. In a few generations, humans born there, the future Martians, would likely develop characteristics quite distinct from us here on Earth. Firstly, they would have a bone and muscle structure adapted for longer, thinner bones with lower density. This is because the body would not need to support as much weight. On the other hand, they would have smaller muscles but more specialized for coordination and agility with little effort. Regarding height and posture, they would naturally be taller and more slender, as the low gravity favors the elongation of the spine and limbs. Furthermore, due to the low gravity, Martians would frequently need to be born via cesarean section. This would represent a very impactful evolutionary change, as the diameter of the human head has always been limited by evolution to fit through the birth canal during vaginal delivery. Therefore, without this limitation, future Martians would have much larger heads than ours, which could even result in a cognitive upgrade. It's impossible to say for sure that they would be more intelligent than us, but this is a possibility that cannot be ruled out. Remembering that evolution always favors the fittest, natural selection tends to move in this direction. At this point, I'm not even sure if we can still call it natural selection, but for lack of a better term, that's what we consider it. Obviously, this wouldn't happen in 1 or 2 generations, but in the long term, assuming the colony prospered and grew, their respiratory systems would be adapted to the planet. They would have larger lungs with greater vital capacity and a more efficient circulatory system for capturing oxygen from the rarefied air. This adaptation could take longer than others, since initially, the air on Mars would not be naturally breathable. Regarding their skin and pigmentation, they would have thicker, more pigmented skin, most likely with a different color than what we know, to cope with higher radiation and extreme temperatures. Mars does not contain the same natural protection against radiation as Earth, so the first generations would live in shelters to protect themselves, pressurize, and breathe, but they would soon need to adapt to live in that environment. Furthermore, they would probably have vision more sensitive to variations in light and slightly larger eyes, adapted to the weak light of the Martian sun. Do these characteristics remind you of something? That's exactly how we imagine aliens. Nothing more than natural selection, adapting a species to an environment. Even we would be aliens if we were shaped by the wrong environment. In practice, for most typical Martians, it would be nearly impossible to live fully on Earth without constant support. This is because bone loss/fragility caused by low gravity has limited recovery. In astronauts, part of the bone microstructure changes similarly to aging and does not fully return to normal, even after years on Earth. The longer the time spent in low gravity, the greater the accumulated damage, and there is a limited window for recovery. This suggests that someone who grew up their entire life in 0.38 g would have a permanently undersized bone and joint base, completely incompatible with 1 g. The cardiovascular system also adapts to the low-gravity environment, and an upgrade to 1 g in adulthood would require enormous cardiac effort, with a real risk of serious decompensation. Technically, it's not impossible if we think about a future with a lot of technology, artificial gravity, exoskeletons, advanced therapies, but for an average person born and raised on Mars without countermeasures, Earth would be a hostile environment, just as Mars is for humans on Earth. Only those who were prepared from childhood in near 1 g artificial gravity environments would have a reasonable chance of migrating and leading a minimally functional life here. Mars, with the right technology, is supposedly compatible with life and human gestation, but it's far from easy. If a terrestrial pregnancy has several serious obstacles, a human pregnancy on Mars would face many more challenges. And even with all the technology, it's still not possible to guarantee 100% healthy development as on Earth. The biggest concerns would be radiation and low gravity. Outside of protective environments, the mother and fetus would receive much more radiation, increasing the risk of malformations, growth retardation, and problems in the baby's nervous system. Regarding low gravity, 0.38 g, studies with animals in microgravity show problems with embryo implantation, placenta formation, and pregnancy maintenance. In other words, we still don't know what the minimum safe gravity is for a human pregnancy. Microgravity and extreme environments disrupt hormones, the reproductive cycle, uterine blood flow, and labor itself, which can reduce pregnancy rates and increase pregnancy losses. Even if all this were overcome, we would still have an atypical psychological and social environment. In other words, confinement, stress, irregular sleep, and isolation also affect fertility, pregnancy, and the mental health of the mother and, consequently, the baby. Without heavy protection and specific protocols, the chance of things going wrong would be much greater than on Earth. Even if all of this worked, Martian babies would be quite different. Even though they are human, their bones and muscles would develop differently as children grow, responding to a gravity of 38 centimos. The natural tendency is to develop a more fragile skeleton and less robust muscles, adapted to Mars, not Earth. Regarding their immune system, the baby would have contact with a much lower microbial diversity than on Earth, resulting in a naive immune system, more vulnerable to infections if they come to Earth later. Furthermore, growing up in a confined, artificial environment with little nature and limited social interaction can impact cognition, emotions, and socialization, but this is more of an environmental risk than a direct biological one. Therefore, Mars is not automatically incompatible with human life from conception, but humanity would have to transform the Martian colony into a giant technological womb, managing each stage of reproduction and growth almost like a continuous medical experiment. Assuming all these challenges are overcome and Martian civilization flourishes, it is still likely that prejudices would arise between Earthlings and Martians, and this could turn into a deep social division, almost like two different human races, even with partially compatible DNA. Partially because in a few generations they would change so much that they would literally be a new species. In practice, prejudice would first appear due to visible physical differences: taller, more fragile, different skin, etc. These aspects would serve as a basis for discrimination, as already happens today among humans themselves. Furthermore, Earth and Mars would have very distinct cultures. A Martian society would have different values, laws, and priorities, shaped by scarcity, constant risk, and isolation, which would generate estrangement and distrust in relation to Earth standards. This becomes fertile ground for the growth of xenophobia, space prejudice, and stigmas on both sides. This is very reminiscent of the dynamics of historical colonization, racism, and xenophobia that we already know, only amplified to an interplanetary scale. As a possible social consequence, humans and Martians would likely develop separate identities. Martians might begin to see themselves as a distinct people, with their own nationality, culture, and even spirituality, reinforcing their sense of not belonging to Earth. This discrepancy could lead to political conflicts, such as disputes over resources, environmental decisions, control of technology, and the colony's political autonomy. All of this could generate tensions between Earth governments and Martian cities. Furthermore, there is the potential for segregation of mobility, since many Martians would not be able to live well on 1G, potentially solidifying a physical and social boundary determined by their planet of origin, hindering profound cultural exchanges. Obviously, narratives of superiority would emerge from both sides. Earthlings would defend the idea that we are the original humans, adapted to the mother planet, while Martians would argue that they are the next stage of evolution, those who face the harshest environment and advance the species frontier. All of this could result in tense relations, strategic alliances, but also periods of boycotts, institutional discrimination, and even Martian separatist movements demanding total independence from Earth. It's not hard to imagine this happening, as it has happened so many times on Earth, but on a much larger scale, never before seen. Considering online coexistence between humans and Martians, this would be an enormous challenge, as we humans can't even coexist with ourselves, let alone with another species derived from our own. If we are already hostile towards other human groups living in the same gravity and on the same planet, a visually different Martian group with a different culture would be an obvious target for attacks. On the other hand, Martians wouldn't be far behind in the culture war either, as they are like us, and would seek to attack back to defend themselves. Just as humans would see Martians as different, the reverse would be true. There would likely be a lot of conflict and hate speech at the beginning, and it's not inevitable that online environments would need to be partially separated. Even with strong rules and moderation, tension would be constant in these shared environments between the two species. The tendency is for both private and public virtual environments to exist. It would be necessary to undergo a period of digital education on both planets, demonstrating how online hate fuels offline violence and reinforces structural inequalities. Interplanetary missions could be seriously compromised by the hatred and rivalry between the two species. It is even possible that humans from Earth sent on missions to Mars would run serious risks of being harassed and suffering real violent attacks, and vice versa. In addition to all the challenges of interplanetary travel, there would also be this cultural barrier between the two peoples. This risk would seriously increase based on colonial narratives. That is, the Martian population might see themselves as exploited or controlled by Earth. Extreme inequality would lead Martians to view Earthlings as having more privileges, access to better technology, a higher quality of life, or protected zones, while Martians live in hostile conditions on a strange planet where they have had to adapt to survive. This would create a real sense of underrepresentation. Martians would feel voiceless in decisions involving the presence of Earth teams in their cities. It wouldn't be long before conflicts and separatist movements began. And thus, we go from being a derived species to competing species for survival. Studies on the colonization of Mars already indicate that, as the colony gains autonomy, tensions arise over resources, political power, and independence from Earth, similar to ancient colonies here in the past. This would result in disputes over who controls Martian resources, water, minerals, space routes, and who controls critical technology. These disagreements could escalate from political and cultural conflict to actual military conflict. At this point, so many generations will have passed that a complete identity divide and an interplanetary armed conflict cannot be ignored. With a superior structure, Earth would have an initial advantage in the conflict, but it is impossible to know to what extent the Martians have evolved, so they should not be underestimated. Mars would be at a strategic disadvantage, as it is extremely vulnerable, with few habitats, fewer people, and dependence on fragile systems. A few successful attacks could eliminate a large fraction of the population. Earth, on the other hand, would have greater population and industrial resilience, but would be heavily dependent on satellites. In the event of a space war that destroys many satellites, it could collapse communications, GPS, logistics, and even financial systems. The most likely scenario is that a war could practically annihilate the Martian colony, but Earth would not emerge unscathed from the conflict, at least not its population. With both sides attacking with everything they have, Earth would annihilate the people of Mars first, or at least almost all of them. Mars would be practically wiped out as a civilization, but Earth would be so damaged that it could take generations to recover. Since the two planets are quite far apart, attacks would be detected well in advance. The average Earth-Mars distance ranges from 55 million to 400 million kilometers, 6 to 24 minutes for light/communication, 6 to 9 months for manned spacecraft, making any war slow and strategic, not quick like in science fiction movies. Earth would still have a huge advantage in the early detection of Martian attacks, thanks to advanced observatories and radars being able to intercept them weeks or months in advance. Mars, on the other hand, would have limited capabilities, detecting terrestrial threats only in days or weeks. Such a slow conflict could extend for a very long time, unless things escalated to the speed of light. Lasers supposedly travel at the speed of light, approximately 300,000 kilometers per second, reaching planets almost instantaneously, 4 to 22 minutes from Mars to Earth, but they wouldn't be practical as direct planet-to-planet weapons due to physical and technical limitations. Lasers function perfectly in space, without an atmosphere to absorb/scatter, allowing a direct line of sight between planetary surfaces. Real experiments have already shown lasers reaching Mars, when NASA measured interplanetary distances with weak laser pulses, up to 81 million kilometers, proving that the signal survives. So, in theory, a powerful laser from Mars could hit terrestrial targets almost in real time, and vice versa. There are still some practical limitations, which could make the operation unfeasible. There is the problem of beam divergence, as lasers spread with distance diffraction. At an average distance of 100 million kilometers, a laser 1 m in diameter becomes a 0.1 kilometer wide, diluting the energy over the area and rendering it harmless. This would need to be compensated for if any real effect was desired. For example, to damage a satellite at that distance, you would need gigantic, kilometer-long, base stations and insane power, terawatts. Furthermore, even in a vacuum, any laser beam would be absorbed and reflected by clouds, dust, and ozone upon entering our atmosphere, which would reduce or even neutralize the damage. Therefore, a laser war would only work against bright space or nighttime targets, such as orbiting satellites or interplanetary spacecraft. Even if all these challenges were overcome, it would still require surgically precise alignment as the planets move. Thus, it would be necessary to maintain perfect aim for minutes, which demands advanced AI tools and extreme stabilization. Even assuming precise shots, there is still the problem of energy and cooling. That is, generating lethal power, terawatts, between the two planets requires enormous orbital nuclear reactors, which demands astronomical cooling. Overheating in the vacuum of space is a problem because there is no air to dissipate the heat. In other words, the only two options for conflict between the two planets are a slow and inefficient war or an extremely limited laser war. At most, Earth could develop an orbital or lunar base and intercept most Martian attacks. An Earth-based orbital base equipped with lasers could fry Martian satellites or spacecraft before they even got close to our planet's atmosphere. This would be the most effective use of lasers, which don't need to travel the entire distance between the two planets. Considering all the risks we have explored, physiological, social, and military, colonizing Mars may be more of a problem than a solution in the short to medium term, but it depends on the long-term perspective and humanity's objectives. There are physiological and ethical risks for humans, as human adaptation to Mars would be problematic, reproduction is uncertain, and it is possible that this would cause enormous generational suffering in a hostile environment, without any guarantee of sustainable quality of life. The inevitable social divisions, prejudices, xenophobia, and rebellions experienced by historical colonies could lead to costly and destructive wars. If there's one thing our history shows, it's that humans are a violent and destructive species, and this would escalate to another level if we managed to play outside our backyard. Moral issues are also quite relevant, as there is the risk of contamination of possible Martian life, exploitation by elites, and the risk of catastrophic failure, condemning colonists to a possible slow death at all stages of the process. And we haven't even mentioned the possibility of other alien civilizations intervening in the process, which would put us in an even more difficult situation. Instead, it would be better to compare the cost/benefit and invest in our own planet. All the trillions of dollars spent on Mars could easily solve all of Earth's problems, such as hunger, climate, and global poverty, with immediate returns. The idea would be to forget what's out there and prioritize our own planet, which we already know works. It really seems quite irresponsible to risk so much for a dubious Plan B. The truth is that humankind is already an incredible creature. It doesn't need to go to another planet to prove it. Just look inside our own planet and see how we've grown as a civilization, and the only thing that prevents us from evolving is ourselves, not planetary limitations. If you enjoyed this exercise in imagination, consider subscribing to our channel, liking the video, and commenting with your opinion on the subject. Suggest in the comments below the next topic you would like to see here on the channel. Until next time.